to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, our guest is Andy McCarthy, contributing editor of National Review. Andy recently was a guest at a PRI luncheon to discuss his new book, The Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. For our listeners who couldn't make the luncheon, I had a chance to do this podcast interview with Andy on his new book, chat about the latest fallout of the Muller investigations, as well as get his take on some national security issues we're facing, including Iran and China. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round, Andy. How are you?
I'm doing just great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So you've got a new book out. It's so new it came out just the other day, and we haven't had a chance to read it yet. The title is The Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. So in the book, you expose the depth of the politicization of our law enforcement and intelligence agencies in the federal government. So these government agencies that have been traditionally seen as unbiased, indeed, they employ some of the most able professionals in government. How did this politicization take hold? What's the genesis, you think?
I think where it probably goes off the rails is the idea that the headquarters of these agencies, which usually plays the role of enforcing the guidelines and standards of the Justice Department, put itself into the role of actually doing the investigation. And I think what we see come out of that is that when the headquarters, the supervisors, become the investigators, there's no one there to tell them no when they want to press the envelope, like all investigators always want to press the envelope. And I really think that that's a big part of it. I also think that the Obama administration was just particularly political when it came to not only intelligence matters and weaving narratives in order to further administration objectives, but also to use the law enforcement processes in a very punitive way. So I think when they decided that they needed a narrative after Mrs. Clinton lost the election, it was easy for these guys to come up with one because it's kind of what they do.
Let's touch on the Muller Report, which you've written extensively on. As you pointed out, and so many others, Mueller's congressional testimony was a bumbling fiasco. So you're in California this week. What can our listeners, informed Californians that they are, but not so interested in the Beltway intrigues and twists and turns and plots, what can they take away from the Mueller investigation? Is it safe to say that we can all move on now?
Well, I think if you have a little detachment from the craziness of Washington, that's a sign of mental health, and San Francisco doesn't always get accused of that, so I think that's a boon for you guys. As far as whether the Mueller investigation is over, it depends on what you thought the Mueller investigation was for in the first place. I think that it's over in the sense of the collusion narrative is dead. The collusion, the effort, which is what fueled this investigation and this effort for 3 years to try to establish that there was a conspiratorial relationship between Trump and the Putin regime, that's dead. But I think my view of the objective of what became the Mueller investigation, for what it's worth, has always been the ultimate objective is to damage Trump politically so that he's unelectable by the time we get to the stretch run of the 2020 campaign. And for that reason, I think you'll continue to hear a lot about what was in the Mueller report, in particular the obstruction volume of it.
So in June, you testified in front of the House Intelligence Committee. How was that like, especially being questioned by the likes of Adam Schiff and other Democrats who were so sure of a Russian collusion?
Well, it's interesting. Chairman Schiff, for example, could not possibly have been nicer or more gracious to me. He made a point of welcoming me to the committee when I got there. He looked for me and we had a nice chat after it was over. I don't think I'm giving away anything by saying that what we talked about was how nice it would be to be able to get back to the idea that we're not the enemy, Russia's the enemy, and to try to sort of remember that. I of course said as soon as you guys are ready to get back to that, we'll get back to that. But it was an interesting hearing in that I was worried that it would be acrimonious just because the hearings that had begun the day before I testified were. John Dean had testified and there was a lot of vitriol that went back and forth because his appearance was viewed as trying to inject the specter of Watergate into the proceedings. And I didn't know what to expect given that had happened. And I was pleasantly surprised to see I was on a panel with two former FBI counterintelligence executives. And I think collectively the three people on the panel must have had in excess of 60, 70 years of law enforcement and intelligence experience. And they really did treat us like subject matter experts rather than political hacks. I was gratified to have the chance to talk about FISA law because I think it's a very important corpus of law. We need it badly. I don't know that we need FISA in particular, but we need these national security tools in order to protect the country. And I got to weigh in on why the abuse of these tools is so dangerous for national security purposes, which I think is much more important than the 2016 election. What I've always been interested in and what got me drawn into this investigation in the first place is the fear that if the public doesn't think that we can use these intelligence tools responsibly and that nobody, when they're abused, that nobody ever is held accountable, there'll be a big demand in Congress that these tools get stripped, and if you strip them, you can't protect the country.
You touched on this a little earlier. Do you think the Mueller investigation was always about impeachment, and is there a chance of that happening now?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Mueller investigation, what we call the Mueller investigation now, was that really is just sort of the end stage of what was a number of strands that I think start out as kind of an intelligence community investigation, really generated by as much foreign intelligence services as our own intelligence service. And I think this really goes back to 2015. It becomes the Mueller investigation very late in the game. It's not really the Mueller investigation until May of 2017. So I always look at it as the long-term investigation that the Mueller thing was the end piece of. And the way I've always looked at this is there's kind of a continuum. The counterintelligence investigation was, I think, a criminal investigation, or it was intended to be a criminal investigation without a predicate for what you need for a criminal investigation, which is a crime. So it was kind of an investigation in search of a crime. They finally tried to do that with obstruction, and then the criminal investigation, I think, became, in large part, a pretext to do an obstruction investigation. Impeachment. And that was to try to generate information that perhaps would be good enough to remove Trump if they thought it was serious enough in Congress. I think ultimately what this was all about was even the impeachment drivel is pretextual in a way because the objective here is to make Trump unelectable. You need a two-thirds supermajority in the Senate to remove the president, and that's such a high hurdle. That's why we've never really impeached the president in our history, and they were never going to achieve that. So I think this is, if they could have found something that was egregious enough to impeach, they would certainly have done that. But the whole objective here has been about the 2020 campaign more than anything else.
Andy, while the Russian collusion probe looks like it's over, there's still a lot of unanswered questions that goes to the credibility of our justice system. You don't need to know the law to intuitively understand that using one's investigative powers to take down a presidential candidate is wrong. Presenting information to the court that one knows to be sketchy, like this dossier, is wrong. Has justice been served in these cases?
If what people are hoping for is they're going to be in a bunch of indictments and people are going to get prosecuted at the end, I think that is not going to happen. And in many ways, it shouldn't happen. Abuses of power are much more difficult to prove than crimes. They're often much more serious than prosecutable crimes. But it's very different trying to prove them. And I don't think the goal should be to indict people. The goal should be, let's find out accurately what happened here. Let's take whatever measures are necessary to take to try to prevent it from happening again, because that's more important than anything else. And then if it turns out when you get an accurate rendering of what happened that people violated the law, you can deal with it at that point. And if they violated it in a prosecutable way, then you let the chips fall where they may. But at the same time, I would point out that the people who were the major players in this investigation have all been removed, and they've either been removed because of the change of administrations, or they've been removed in disciplinary or administrative investigations. We're about to get a report, we think, in September from the Inspector General, who's looking at the origins of the investigation and the potential FISA abuse. And we also know that Attorney General Barr, who's been very serious about getting to the bottom of this, And I think that change in tone has been very positive and has had a good effect on the Justice Department and the FBI. But he's conducting an investigation with John Durham, who is the U.S. attorney from Connecticut that he brought in for that purpose. So I think we are going to get accountability, but I think the people will be disappointed, and maybe they should be disappointed if they think that the only accountability here is if people are, frog marched out of their homes and out of their offices in handcuffs. That's not going to happen.
It's pretty clear that there's no evidence that Trump colluded with the Russians in the presidential election. The reality is that the Russians did attempt to interfere with our election process. But you argue at an article you wrote recently that the U.S. is perhaps the most active country in the world in its attempt to influence politics, governance, and even elections. And you cite Obama's attempt to unseat Netanyahu in Israel. If we start creating rules to report foreign outreach, you think that countries won't reciprocate in providing valuable intelligence. Can you expand on this point?
Well, I think this is what countries do. Great countries and even not so great countries, when they have interests in the world, they try to influence the decision makers and the countries who are consequential in terms of what their interests are in the world. And we do more than our share of it. So I've always thought that it was a mistake, particularly in connection with the Muller investigation, for example, to file an indictment against Russian government operatives who were said to have been involved in the hacking. First of all, no such indictment was ever going to be tried in an American courtroom. And secondly, when you are a great power and you've been attacked, and that's what they said, that the Russians had engaged in information warfare against us, well, then you don't react to it by filing indictments and subpoenas. That was the big problem we had in the 1990s, where our terrorist enemies were attacking us with bombs and we were responding with legal process, which is not how a serious country reacts. But I also think, the biggest fallout of all this is because we're so active in the world in terms of our intelligence agencies and trying to influence events in the world, by suggesting that interfering in other countries' affairs is a sort of a felony crime that you ought to be hauled into court and prosecuted for. I think we make it much more difficult for our own intelligence agents to do their jobs, and their jobs are already dangerous as it is. So I just think it's a politically driven, poor set of judgments to make, to attack what happened here as if it were a crime, when we do plenty of these kind of intelligence operations ourselves, and they're vital to our security, and I think we don't want to be making it even more difficult for our own intelligence operatives to operate.
So let's turn to a few national security issues. Ever since the U.S. has backed off from the nuclear deal, relations with Iran are as tense as ever. The U.S. accused Iran of attacking a couple of oil tankers earlier this summer, and Iran recently shot down a U.S. drone. We know that economic sanctions have crippled Iran's economy, but you talked about settling for nothing less than regime change. Do you think the Iranians are near to a point where they will rise against the regime?
Yeah, see, this is the eternal question that goes back almost to 1979, when this Khomeinist regime began. And part of the difficulty in drawing this calculation is that we just don't have the greatest intelligence about Iran. So I've had people who are Iran watchers tell me for the last 30 years that the Iranian uprising is right around the corner, and it never seems to come. It looked like it was bubbling up to the surface, and perhaps you were going to have upheaval in 2009, but the regime crushed it, and we didn't do what President Reagan had done, for example, when the Poles rose up in the death throes of the Soviet Union. And I think that that is a role that the United States can play in the world. We don't have to jump in and intervene in every country in the sense of invading, but we should be champions of liberty. I think we should be champions of liberty not only in Iran, but in Hong Kong and every place where people are rising up and struggling to be free. I'm against this idea that you need to invade Sharia societies and try to stay there until we turn Kabul into Kansas. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but we should be an example of liberty to people. And we should be giving tyrannical regimes a very hard time. And my idea about Iran is simply this. They are our enemy. That regime is incorrigibly opposed to the United States. It's never going to change. Everybody says you're just a warmonger, you want war. I'm just acknowledging facts. They have been at war with us for 30 or 40 years. Somebody do the math better than me. But the point being, you can't avoid a war if an enemy decides that they're going to be at war with you. And you can't just, by taking your ball and going home. That is not the way that you end wars. It's the way you lose wars and compromise your own interests. To my mind, we don't have to invade Iran, but I would never take that off the table. I don't think that regime is ever going to be redeemed. I think it has to be overthrown. It basically has to be overthrown from within, although we ought to give it, the people resisting that regime, as much help as we can give it. And we ought to turn every lever of government power toward regime change. And what I mean by that is to simply, to stop playing games like, oh, well, this regime may be fine, maybe we'll be able to negotiate it with. We want you gone. And I would be unapologetic about that and unambiguous about it. And when they call us on it, I'd say, you're damn right we want you gone.
Another flashpoint is China. While trade is dominating the headlines, the heart of our dispute really lies in the intellectual property theft by the Chinese. Do you think there are other ways, say legal, as an attorney, to stop China other than this trade war that we're having now?
Yeah, this is very related to what we just discussed with Iran. I think our intelligence agencies, our treasury people, our law enforcement people, there's a lot of leverage that we have on China, and there's a lot more that we could do other than the trade policy. The economy is essentially, it's an export economy that is dependent on having access to our markets. We have a lot of leverage there. But I think one of the things you have to decide as a country before you can make a sensible policy is, how do you regard the other country? Do you regard it as a potential ally? Do you regard it as they sometimes say, a strategic partner, as something that's an emerging nation that's actually going to become something akin to a Western democracy? Or is it an enemy? Is it hostile? Is it anti-American? And does it have designs on supplanting America in the world, or at least in that region? I think that China seems definitely to me to be in the last category. And when you have a country that's an adversary, I think it's a mistake to treat it as if it were an ally or a potential partner until you get behavior that indicates that they're trending in that direction. I do not believe that you can convert a bad country, a tyrannical country, into a good, normal Western democracy by treating it as if it were one, and then hoping that it'll come along. So I would, I think one of the things we have to decide is, who is China? What do we want our relationship to be with it in light of who it really is? And then I think you organize all your policy along those lines, and we haven't done that yet. We can't make up our mind about China.
Let's turn to some domestic issues. In the wake of the mass shootings recently in El Paso, Dayton, and here in Gilroy, California, you suggested in an article for National Review that perhaps we should employ some of the same policing tactics that have been so successful in this country thwarting terrorist attacks. This would mean focusing on gathering intelligence on people who adhere to extreme ideologies that could translate into violence, rather than the current method of prosecuting these people after the fact. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, one of the things that we learned and should have internalized more in the counterterrorism of the 90s is we were in a law enforcement posture where you're generally waiting for something bad to happen before you react. The normal way that we act in this country is a crime gets committed, and then you assign investigators and prosecutors and the like. And when you're dealing with things that are not manageable crime problems, but actual threats to your society, you have to try to reorient your thinking so that you're in a prevention mode rather than just a post facto prosecution mode. And the way that we did that with terrorism was not only to recognize that it wasn't a simple crime problem, but also to have an intelligence-first approach where we prioritized gathering information, processing information, trying to map terrorist organizations, trying to squeeze their or choke off their resources. And the goal became to interrupt plots before they could metastasize into something that was horrific. And I think when you're dealing with any hate ideology where mass murder is not only a potential objective, it's a foreseeable consequence, you have to go into an intelligence mode. And one of the I think tragic pushbacks in counterterrorism was that because radical Islam, which is really a totalitarian political ideology, because it's cloaked in religion, it made people very nervous in terms of investigating it, understanding it, and trying to prevent horrific acts from being taken on the basis of ideology. We got this idea that because the First Amendment was involved, we couldn't even look at the ideology. And of course, if you don't understand what the enemy is thinking, what the enemy is trying to accomplish, you can't, as a practical matter, protect yourself. So there's a long history in the law of, it's one thing to say that the First Amendment protects you from being prosecuted for your expression. You can't be arrested for anything you say, no matter how vile it is, as long as it's political expression and you're not inciting violence. But speech and expression have always been usable in court for purposes of evidence, and they've always been available for purposes of intelligence. And I think, one of the things we did that I think was wrong in Obama-era counterintelligence was to say that we're not going to look at ideology because it's constitutionally protected. The answer is we don't prosecute ideology because it's constitutionally protected, but we do look at it. We have to look at it in order to protect ourselves. And with these new hate ideologies that we're dealing with, not that white supremacism and white racism is new, but it's a challenge that's now come to the fore. You have to look at that ideology, and you have to free police and investigators, not just to be reactive in terms of waiting for violent acts to happen. You have to send them out to the places where we know that people congregate, and keep their ear to the ground and talk to people and try to figure out who the problem actors are and try to stop them before they get started.
So finally, for our very last question, our podcast is called Next Round because we love to talk about policy, drinking a glass of wine or other alcoholic beverage. So what will you be drinking these days to celebrate your new book?
Well, it's summertime and it's been very warm in New York, and we're on this weird kick. My wife and I can't seem to get on the same page. So when I was ready to drink Pinot Noir, she was drinking the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, and now I'm happy to drink Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, and she's on to Pinot Noir. But I guess as long as we're having that kind of a disagreement, that's a kind of disagreement we can tolerate, right? But I'm hoping to get home and proceed with that tomorrow.
Any favorite labels you'd like to recommend?
I've been drinking this Ponzi Pinot Gris. It's good. And my wife has been drinking, for a while we were getting, the Wild Horse Pinot Noir. We're not exactly connoisseurs, but we do okay.
Thanks so very much.
Thank you.
Special thanks to our guest, Andy McCarthy. And if you're interested in reading more of his work, go to nationalreview.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Marlena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.